Let's turn now, though, to the story which is dominating the news today, and that's the collapse of Britain's second largest construction firm, Carillion. The company employs 20,000 people in the UK, and its work stretched from the HS2 rail project and military contracts to maintaining hospitals, schools and prisons. Now, there are plenty of questions being asked about the collapse, from the hefty pay packets given to the company's bosses to what support the government is giving to the firm's employees and contractors, not to mention the eventual cost to the taxpayer. Our correspondent Chris Mason has been following it all closely. Chris, the government is no doubt starting to count the cost in more ways than one of Carillion going under. It said there would be no taxpayer bailout, but what is it committed to paying in terms of people's jobs and wages?
It's a huge challenge, this, Jo. So the government has said that in the short term its focus is on ensuring that the services that Carillion is meant to deliver can be delivered, whether that be the provision of school meals, for instance, or cleaning hospitals. But yeah, as you say, there is then the vast consequences in the medium and long term. So what about that giant pension deficit, for instance? What about all of those smaller firms who were subcontractors of Carillion? Around 30,000 firms, one trade body suggesting this morning, are effectively customers of Carillion. Huge question marks around how they are going to be paid for work that they've done and that they say they are owed money for. And so what has happened is the government set up its Cobra committee that met last night. There was a whole wave of ministers, a march of ministers into the Cabinet Office last night from all over Whitehall, which really painted the picture of the extent to which the tentacles of Carillion run into all aspects of the public sector. Cabinet has been meeting this morning. There's a briefing for Westminster journalists happening right now on those Cabinet discussions. No doubt Carillion a big topic there. And then there's the bigger question that very much is being seized upon by Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, which is to pose that question that hasn't really been a staple of mainstream politics for quite a while now, which is to what extent should private sector firms have a big involvement in the delivery of public sector work? We saw the Blair and Brown governments under Labour being very comfortable with the likes of Carillion and others being involved in the delivery of public services. The Coalition, the Conservatives have been keen on that as well. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn very keen to say that there should be a shift away from what he sees as the outsource first dogma. So I think that's going to be the, if you like, the coming political battle,
yes.
Given the gap that there is now between Labour and the Conservatives on the instinct about how this is delivered.
The other side, of course, which will anger the public, is the issue of salaries and bonuses that have been paid and to some extent are still continuing to be paid to the senior staff and executives at Carillion. Now, the Department of Business has just put out the following release asking for investigation into directors to be fast-tracked. Do you think that'll be enough to assuage the anger of people looking at what has been called in some papers fat cat bonuses?
Yeah, I think there's a keen awareness, Jo, in government about just how toxic this is, because on the one hand you've got, as I say, these 30,000 firms, small and medium-sized businesses, the very kind of people and entrepreneurs that every political party, but particularly the Conservatives, are always keen to appeal to, who are worried about getting paid. And on the other hand, talk of these vast amounts of money being paid out to senior executives. Now, there was a real awareness yesterday, I think it'll be reflected again today within government, that there shouldn't be a sense of rewards for failure. There shouldn't be a sense of, if you like, socialising losses whilst privatising huge gains and profits. So yeah, there'll be an acute awareness about how that is handled. Now, the government's been saying that that's in the hands at the moment of the official receiver, but I think you can expect the rhetoric from the very top on this to continue to be pretty sharp.
Chris Mason, thank you. Well, he mentioned the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and he's issued some strong words on the subject of Carillion, and here he is in a message posted online last night.
In the wake of the collapse of the contractor Carillion, it's time to put an end to the rip-off privatisation policies that have done serious damage to our public services and fleeced the public of billions of pounds. This is a watershed moment.
Well, that was the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn in a message online. So is this a watershed moment, as he claims, and do the public agree? Well, Ellie Price has been out with entirely unscientific Daily Politics Mood Box to find out.
It's become a fact of life. Private companies are involved in everything from our schools to our prisons, our railways to our hospitals. Some say when it comes to efficiency, business knows best, while others say it's an experiment that's run its course. So, is public ownership back in fashion? That's what we're asking today. Who would you rather see run your public services? The private or the public sector? Thanks very much.
It depends very much on which public services you're talking about and how well they're going to be funded if it's the public sector and how the deal is going to be brokered if it's the private sector.
We don't want waste, we want money to be spent well and for the taxpayer to get good value and go in that bucket there. Okay.
The private sector, it doesn't really work, and the profit motive is overwhelming.
I think it's a massive question needs to be asked. What is the role of the public sector and how much can be actually delegated to individual people to make their own economic decisions in life?
Thank you. But is it more efficient if you're a private company?
Oh yeah, it is, but efficiency comes at a cost, is the problem.
I think prisons, should revert back to public. Trains, probably public. The private companies seem to be greedy.
I think so. Oh, it's a rainbow.
I think a combination's optimal, but public.
Oh God! Oh, it's running away. Oh.
Because I'm an anarchist.
Oh, okay. How do you have a railway if you don't have a private sector or a public sector?
Because everyone's going to join together as people and we'll all create our own little unions that will manage it.
I think there's some lessons to take from the private sector, sort of efficiencies and that kind of thing. But on the whole, you need to have that kind of thing being looked after by someone who's not trying to make a profit out of it.
I think it should be the public sector, but probably at the moment the private sector is looking after it better.
Well, the day is drawing to a close, and so too is our mood box. And while a number of people said a healthy combination is a good idea, overall the winner here at least was pretty clear. The public sector should look after our public services.
Ellie Price there. Well, a fairly decisive result in the decidedly non-scientific mood box there. But to discuss Carillion and the public-private debate more generally, we're joined by Mick Cash, General Secretary of the RMT Union, and my guest of the day, Anna Soubry, is a former business minister. Before I come to you, Mick Cash, first of all, just on some of the fundamentals, Anna Soubry, in terms of what's going to happen to the staff as make up part of Carillion's workforce. 62% of Carillion's work is in the private sector, and that could be thousands of employees on private contracts. Should the government also guarantee their salaries?
Look, my first port of call on this is actually the workforce, and for a lot of those people, they will be extremely worried about, frankly, whether they're going to get paid this week or this month.
Only till tomorrow, they've been told.
Exactly. So, having been involved in the closure, remember, of a steelworks up in Redcar, there are ways that government can get involved in things to make sure that monies are made available so workers are paid. There are discrete methods often, and that certainly happened in SSI, where we made damn sure that people were paid in the face of those men not being their mainly men,
so
not being paid.
So you think, as well as guaranteeing the wages of the public sector workers, those with public sector contracts, the government should further extend that to the private sector?
No, I'm not saying that. Because I'm not getting into that sort of detail, because I know how those things get spun out. What I'm saying is that there will be ways that the government can make sure that they do everything they can to ensure that those men and women are paid for the work that they have done, and they should use whatever levers they've got to do that. And trust me, there are ways that these things can be done.
Why should employees employed by private sector companies without public sector contracts also be bailed out, if you like, or paid by the taxpayer, the government?
Well, depends what you mean by private sector contracts. Carillion do a lot of work on the railways and other contracts, and are they private or public? So it'll be an interesting point to find out what you mean by private and public, because they've blurred the line completely since they've outsourced the previous governments into the private and public arena. So I'd ask that first question, what do you mean by that? Because ultimately, a lot of the work actually is guaranteed by the taxpayer. It's publicly funded, and in those circumstances, then we should be looking after those workers, because if we don't, the economy is going to suffer. But equally...
Well, how long should they be looked after?
Well, you know, we're in that situation where we've done it before. You know, banks got bailed out. You know, we've seen bails out of Southern and East Coast trains by the government. They're prepared to give them money. And in actual fact, you'll find that a lot of these workers, they've got contracts that are working to. The issue is the company is not trading, but there are contracts and there's work.
Right. Now, there are contracts. They're not public sector contracts in that sense. But if they are providing services, these employees on the railways as cleaners and catering, do you still pay?
Well, you'll continue. Public sector clear things like the delivery of school meals, the cleaning of hospitals, things like that. For example, in something I have some knowledge of, which is the MOD, the delivery of the service accommodation contracts. These contracts can be delivered upon because somebody else can be found to do that work, because that work can't and won't stop.
Well, does that reassure you then?
Very different to the point that you rightly make. Sorry, I think we're in agreement about this, about when do other sorts of contracts actually cross over into a new way that really was introduced by the last government.
We've got members at this moment don't know whether they're going to get paid. They've done work for Network Rail over Christmas. They work for a private sector operator. They're plant operators. Are they going to get paid? We don't know. Yeah. One of the aspects of all of this, by the way, and Anna seems to be very certain about this. I'm not, because I've spoken to the chief executive of Network Rail. I've spoken to the special manager appointed by the administrators to find out actually who's public, who's private, who's going to get paid, and we don't know. And the lack of preparedness by the government in all of this to answer these questions, I think, is shocking.
Well, let's talk about the preparedness. Do you think the government, Anna Soubry, fundamentally dropped the ball in its dealing with this firm over the last 6 to 9 months?
I genuinely don't know. What I do know, because I used to be a business minister, is that you are always kept alert. In any event, we were all alert publicly because they had their profits warning back in July.
Mm-hmm.
So it was clear that this was a company in deep trouble.
So should they have had more government contracts awarded?
Well, that's always that is the very difficult question, and I'm not able to answer it because I don't know enough about it. But it would seem that this is a very difficult one. As government, do you help somebody, or are you cognizant of the fact that they could be in very deep trouble, in which event it could be argued it's not a good thing to do. What I'm confident has happened is that the Secretary of State for Transport in particular will have received advice on that. And if he didn't, I would be rather surprised.
Right, but do you share some of the civil servants who seem to be broadly relaxed that this is what happens? Firms succeed and firms fail.
Well, that is true. That's a market economy which Labour used to support.
Right, is that the case? I mean, Anna Soubry brings up the Labour Party supporting that. Is this, though, a watershed moment? Is this different in the way that Jeremy Corbyn has characterised it than a major company failing and all of the problems that actually brings?
I mean, it shows that outsourcing has failed, the model's broken, and actually we need to bring more back into public hands. I mean, if you're in the private sector, by the way, if you're a chief executive, you get wads of money. If you're shareholders, you get wads of money. And then if the company goes bust, it's the creditors, a lot of them workers at the sharp end, who pay the price. So
no, you missed the point.
Well, hang on, is outsourcing, have we reached the end of the road with outsourcing? I mean, is it time for a review? Even David Liddington, your colleague, seemed to imply there should be a review.
Right, so let me, this is my take on things. One of the big problems that we have is that when we are putting out these big contracts, they invariably go to very big companies, and the medium and small businesses are not included in the way that they should be. So big companies like Carillion, which had an incredible spread of work, which I find rather odd in any event, they get these contracts because government has a responsibility to get the cheapest price to get value for the taxpayer. And then what happens is they can't deliver it.
So whose fault is that? I mean, these things are...
Well, let me explain. So I think we have a problem in the procurement and tendering at both a national and local level because it's too much for these very big companies, because you tend to get what you pay for. So I've got some experience from MOD.
Right.
And my concern was, because this may help you, it'll help you as well, Mick. My concern was, because we've got to be honest about these.
But why not take them back in-house then? I mean, if in the end the taxpayer is having to bail out to some extent.
Please let me just explain what the problem was. So what would happen is that a very big company would say, we can deliver this contract for this amount of money. And people would say, well, we've got to go for the lowest bid, without drilling down, remembering you get what you pay for.
All right.
And then they'd subcontract and subcontract, so you ended up almost in a position where to deliver that contract successfully was almost impossible.
I understand.
Unless you didn't pay people decent money, which concerns me, and you didn't
just making the point for bringing it into the public sector.
No, I didn't.
I
made the point.
Let him answer.
Undercutting and just driving down costs for the profit margin. No, it's not. It's about the profit margin. All they want to do is make money out of this, and to do that, they're going to use taxpayers' money. And when things fail, it's the taxpayer picks up the tab.
I'm old enough to remember when all these things were in the public sector, and it didn't deliver value for money. I don't like the Labour Party always introduced this huge outsourcing, and rightly so. The watershed moment is that this shows the drift in the Labour Party back to the 70s, back to a Marxist way of doing things, which is all about state control. Let the market properly
All right, well, let him respond.
I'm old enough to remember when it was in the public sector, and equally, by the way, I used to be employed by Carillion Rail when they were doing the maintenance contracts for Network Rail, who brought it in-house and saved almost £400 million a year by just bringing their maintenance in-house back in 2004. So we're in that situation where we do know that actually the private sector costs money because they've got the profit motive, they've got to deal with the shareholders. The public sector actually saves money for and every bit of money that gets spent or it's earned actually goes back into the service.
What differentiates because we're running out of time. I'm not ideologically driven, so I want something that works. I'll take private. And if it's right to do it in-house, I'll do it in-house.
And is it right to take it in? Is it right now in this case to take it in-house?
Privatisation, we've seen that.
Driven, and the private sector is out, and it's all about state control.
Should the private sector be involved in delivering public services in the way they have here? Because it seems that privatisation means profits are privatised and losses are nationalised.
No, what it's all about is delivering the best value for the taxpayer. And the point I was making, which I thought...
No, you're not. How are you? Have you seen examples of this?
Talk one at a time, and then I'll let you go.
I'm not ideologically driven. There is a real role for the private sector to play, but it's got to be done in a better way.
Why do the private sector want to do public sector work? Why do they want to do it? Well, to make profit, to make money.
Are you saying, though, that every private sector...
Hang on, that's what pays your workers' wages.
Actually, that's the taxpayer
end that pays for that. That's what keeps our economy going, so we get the great public services.
All right.
And that says more about the Labour Party and the state it's in. Back to Marxism, back to the Trotskyism
so it's Labour Party's fault what's happened with Carillion, then?
No.
So that's Marxism. That's what's caused the Carillion.
Your solution is Marxism.
So
that's what's caused that, is it?
Nick, one question, though. Is it still your view that everything private is bad and public is always good?
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, you're in that situation where, the profit motive just takes money out of the public sector.
All right, and finally to you, do you think the Chief Executive should have his bonus clawed back? £660,000 a year until October 2018.
That's the ex-Chief Executive.
Yep. Yeah. Should it be clawed back?
He's got a conscience, another Chief Executive.
Should it be clawed back?
Well, that's up to him. He's got a conscience. He should do the right thing. It's not for me to tell him what to do. He should know himself. What I will say is this. It's absolutely... Hang on, because of... Look,
let her answer that question. But to be brave, Anna, you normally are. Do you think he should just be deprived of that massive amount of money?
You've paid him the money.
Well, there is a regulator that could deprive him.
Can I just say that I'm very pleased to see the government is accelerating those very strict rules about directors. This is important stuff, and if you are found to have done something wrong, the consequences are huge for you as a director, and rightly so.
Mick, thank you for coming in.